Hello and welcome to JCO's Cancer Stories, the Art of Oncology, which features essays and personal reflections from authors exploring their experience in the field of oncology. I'm your host, Dr. Lidia Schapira, a professor of medicine at Stanford University. And with me today is Dr. Mikkael Sekeres, who is a professor of medicine and the chief of the Division of Hematology at the Sylvester Comprehensive Cancer Center in Miami. In this episode, we will be discussing his new role as the host for the JCO Cancer Stories, the Art of Oncology podcast. Mikkael, welcome to our podcast and thank you for joining me today.
Lidia, what an absolute delight it is to be here with you. And I have to confess, it's also intimidating to think about taking this over from you, given the amazing job you've done over the past few years.
Well, thank you so much for that. This podcast originated as a bit of a dare when Steve Canestra, back in 2017, said no to some idea that I had for changing or expanding the section and issued the dare of, why don't you do a podcast instead? And back in 2017, I had no idea, and we were less used to podcasts. So I trained myself, and then this beautiful new form sort of emerged just from my idea and dream of giving our listeners and our readers something new to chew on and to reflect on.
Well, it turned out to be prescient, didn't it? I can't tell you how many people I know, especially here in Miami, where we do tend to get caught in traffic and have a long commute time. I'm sure that never happens to you in Palo Alto.
Of course not.
But people listen to a lot of podcasts, and it's a great way to catch up on personalities and on books and on the news. So good for you. I'm so happy you took the dare and ran with it.
Yes. And the first thought I had was to make it a bit artsy. So we started for the first couple of years of rounding up everybody we knew who was an actor or had a voice that they used for their art or trade, and asked them to read the essays or poems before we had the conversation with the author. Now we have our own voice actor, so we know what we're going to get every week, and we're not looking for people and knocking on doors and asking very busy actors to donate their time. So it has evolved, as has the writing, really. So I wondered if you can reflect a little bit on how you see this section, both in the journal and also the conversations we're having in this podcast, change and evolve over the years.
Let's be honest, we're both writers, right? So as a writer, you're always looking for an outlet for your work. And there aren't a lot of outlets in medical journals. Yet there's this huge audience of doctors and nurses and pharmacists and social workers who read these journals and have this incredible experience with this deluge of humanity we see every single day. So this is an incredible thing that Art of Oncology was even created a couple decades ago and provided this outlet for people. And what I've noticed is that people have become more daring. So let's play on the dare that you took up to even start this podcast. They've become more daring in what they're willing to write about and in how vulnerable they're willing to be in print. I've seen this in my own career, in my own writing, where 20 years ago I came out of fellowship and very cautiously started to write about some of the experiences that I had, but it was cautious and used more professional language and didn't get into some of the vulnerabilities that we face in treating patients and that we experience in ourselves and in our colleagues. But I think people have been willing to share more of themselves, particularly in the last decade.
I totally agree with you. And one of the things that I've noticed is that we have younger writers and younger authors who are now taught, even during their medical training and postgraduate work, that writing as a way of processing emotionally difficult experiences or sharing interesting thoughts or coming together as a community is really important to create the kind of community of thoughtful practitioners that we need to sustain us while we do this difficult work. So we are having more and more submissions and published work from very young colleagues, trainees. And I find it very interesting, sort of this multi-generational way of expressing the contact with very ill patients, and sometimes very moving to think back on, the first time you gave bad news for those of us who may have done it 100,000 times.
So I think you're spot on about this, right? We're getting younger authors. We're getting folks who are early career, mid-career. Now we're receiving essays from folks who are at the end of their career and want to reflect on that career, right? And people we wouldn't have expected would write these vulnerable essays either. I wonder if some of the pieces we're getting from younger authors stems from the fact that fellowship programs are finally paying attention to the experience of being a fellow and being a trainee.
Oh my goodness, it was staring at them all this time. I think when you were a fellow a long time ago, you were one of the advocates of having fellows talk to one another about their experience, right?
You have an incredible memory. During our fellowship, we started a Ballant physician awareness group. So there's this movement started by the Ballants, a husband and wife team, to start to get healthcare providers to reflect on their experience and share that experience with each other to build a community of support. And we started this in our fellowship. And you can imagine the initial reaction to this among the fellowship directors was, why do you need that? What do you think you're doing? But there's no place for that.
And we need our time to train them on the science. This is maybe an extra, right? I think many of us have felt that trying to advance anything that deals with humanism or the human side of providing care is considered maybe optional. And I think you and I have been pushing against that for a long time.
I think that's exactly right. What I think legitimized it a little bit is we got funding for it from the Schwartz Foundation. We then actually published a study looking at it in JCO because the fellows in our program spent time at two different hospitals. So it was by design this crossover study where half the fellows got the intervention of the Ballant group and half didn't. And it turns out, lo and behold, they actually felt better and had a better experience as a fellow when they had the intervention.
Yeah, it's so interesting that we had to turn it into a randomized control trial or whatever design you picked, but you needed to fit it into the section of the journal that respected the logic and process of scientific research. But that brings me to another point I think that we have talked about so much, but I think it's important for us to share with listeners, and that is that the section of the journal that we've created now, it used to be when the tumor is not the target, and we've shortened the title, The Art of Oncology, is not a section for papers that address research or where there is no methods and results section. It is intentionally meant to be different from the rest of the journal. Is that how you see it too?
Oh, my word. Absolutely. And our reviewers occasionally will have a submission that is more of a classic article in how it's structured. And our reviewers will push against it. And sometimes we're able to get back to the author and say, could you write this in a different way? Something that's more reflective of Art of Oncology. I think it's meant to be, I don't want to say a break from the way other articles are written, but maybe a different style, a different way of using your brain in reading these articles. And we've seen that they're popular. Sometimes they are the most read article, even in JCO, in a given week, which of course we share with each other and gloat a little bit when that happens.
Yes, and it doesn't have to be the article that made you cry. It can also be the article that made you think. That's always been my intention as the editor for this section for the last 10 years. I've tried to be very intentional instead of bringing to our readership articles that delve into different parts of this lived experience of giving care. Some are moving more towards ethical conflicts. Some are moving more towards the emotional labor of the work, but some bring out different voices and different perspectives. And I'm proud to say that the submissions we get really come from all over the world. So I wonder, Mikkael, as you're entering into this role now, your decade as editor for this section and host for our podcast, is how you view the editorial process. How does your team help the authors bring their best article forward?
I took the lead from you. And I'm not saying that just to blow wind in your sail, but you have always given feedback to authors, whether it's a request for a revision and acceptance or turning a piece down that's been helpful, that's been thoughtful, that's been empathic. And in the end, I know that your goal has always been with these reviews to give the author advice moving forward. I've tried to take a page out of your book by doing that as well. I go into every piece. You shared with me that you do the same thing. When I get a submission, I look at it and I'm so excited about what could be there, what truth this could reveal, what angle of thinking about something that I've never thought about before. And our reviewers go into it the same way as well. These are folks who have read hundreds, if not thousands of essays. They themselves are readers, they're writers. They've had submissions accepted to Art of Oncology. They're looking for pieces that reflect a great truth that we all realize. Sometimes it's a great truth that no one wants to talk about. And this is the first time somebody's talking about it. Those are the best pieces, right? Where you read it and say, I thought the same thing, or I had the exact same experience and no one's ever talked about it before. We're looking for good writing. We're looking for pieces that are focused on a patient. And you and I both given talks on narrative medicine. And one of the slides I have in my talk is to remind people that the patient is the most important person in the room and to make that piece focused on the patient's experience. And of course, the writer's reaction to that experience. But in the end, it's all about our patients and their experience. And we're looking for, as you mentioned, perspectives that we haven't seen before. So we want to hear from people who are in training. We want to hear from people in different stages of their careers, people who practice in different settings, people who bring different cultural backgrounds to their own perspective on the practice of oncology.
And if I may point something out to our listeners, you are an artist in being able to bring the bedside verbatims to the page and make them live. I've always admired that in your writing, Mikkael. Can you tell us a little bit about your process for writing and how the role of the editor varies or is different from the role of the writer? Because I've learned a lot about editing, and I think the editor is an interpreter in a way. I'm fascinated. I was brought up in a household where we spoke 4 languages, and I was always fascinated by trying to find the right word in a language and struggling with all of that. And I think some of my love for editing, which is different from my love for writing or reading, comes from that, from trying just to find the right word or trying to respect the voice of the author and make it even better or more artistic. Can you tell us a little bit about your process and your relationship to language and writing and editing?
It's great to hear you come from a family where you spoke 4 languages. I am an unfortunate monoglot. I'm terrible with foreign languages, but I come from a family of English majors. My dad was a journalist for the Providence Journal in Rhode Island, then an editor for 10 years. My mom was an English major as well. So I always think that as parents, our job is to impart one employable skill to our kids so they don't live in our basement forever.
That's what my father thought, and that's why I'm a doctor and not a philosopher.
We joke we moved to Miami, so there is no basement they can live in. But I always felt in my family, the employable skill was writing. You know, I grew up when I went to med school, I think we put on this armor of the language we're learning, and we're very uncomfortable and nervous about the skills that we have. So we use this language to separate ourselves from our uncertainty around medicine. I distinctly remember at one point talking to my parents and saying something that was very complex using medicalese. And they said to me, why are you talking to us like this? We're your parents. You don't have to use that language. Just use language we can understand. And that always resonated me. That was kind of a North Star moment for me. That's what's guided my writing. And I have so much respect for the words that my patients use. And I think that's why I try to incorporate it in my essays as well. I always try to have my patient's voice literally there in their words as a focal point. I think as an editor, we go into a piece and we want to learn something. In the end, essays either educate or entertain, and ideally both, right? So we want to come out of a piece, we want to be either emotionally moved or we want to learn something, and hopefully both things. And if I'm reading a piece as an editor and one of those 2 criteria have been satisfied, then I think it's a piece that's worth giving feedback to and advising revision. But I'm curious, I want to turn this a little bit, Lidia, because you're the one who always asks the questions.
I love asking questions.
So I'd like to ask you a question. When did you get started as a writer and a reader? And has that interest and skill changed over the course of your career?
Yes, I must say I've always been a reader. That's, my idea of heaven is a place with an enormous amount of books and a good espresso machine. So just to give you an idea. So books have always provided companionship to me. They've provided community. I'm very happy living in a world of ideas, and I love art, and I love the sound of words and beautiful words put together beautifully. So that's basically reading and thinking to me are very closely aligned. And I also love and come from a culture, a society where conversation was valued. And I'm very sad that we don't anymore. We don't converse in our typical academic settings because we're so busy, and our language is mostly turned into units of efficiency. So I love the idea of communicating through language, words, spoken words, things we listen to, things we read, things we write. My relationship to writing has been very undisciplined and inconsistent. And for all the years that I was an editor for this section, I found myself sort of inhibited from writing. And from the moment that I passed the baton on to you, I've been gushing. So I'm working on a book, and hopefully it'll be the first of several, but I've sort of kept my writing very private, and I've only been able to do it when I have a lot of time and no pressure. I'm not the kind of disciplined writer who can set aside time every day to write. I just can't do that. I need to be totally empty and free and be able to disagree with myself and erase, 1,000 words written on a page because they're just not good enough, and start again.
I'm fascinated by that comment that you just made. What is it about being an editor that you feel has inhibited you from writing?
I think I just was busy. I was busy, again, immersing myself in the words that I needed to respond to, and in the creative process of transforming essays into their best possible publishable form. And I think that's how I've interpreted the work of editors. I have tremendous respect for editors. I now need one to help me with my own work, but I think editors play an incredible role. And I am very happy that you view this role as something that is joyful. And I know that you have the amazing talent to do it. So I'm just very happy that we've made this transition.
Can I suggest that you've been giving as an editor also? Because I think that your guidance to authors is precious. It's so valuable. Writers are so desperate to have that kind of caring advice. And I wonder if you've devoted all of your creative juices to doing that for the past 10 years, and at the expense of not being able to write yourself. So I'm so thrilled that you have the opportunity now. I will be the first person to buy your book, to write a review for your book. I can't wait to read it.
We've got a blurber. So now I need a good editor and a therapist, and I'm on my way. So on that note, I think it's time for us to end this lovely conversation, although we could go on for a long time. For our listeners, I want to thank you for having listened all these years. And I'm delighted that Dr. Sekeres will continue this wonderful program. And I look forward to listening while I drive, while I walk, and while I just simply am. Thank you for listening to JCO's Cancer Stories, the Art of Oncology. Don't forget to give us a rating or review, and be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can find all of the ASCO shows at asco.org/podcast. And thank you, Mikkael.
Thank you so much, Lidia.
The purpose of this podcast is to educate and to inform. This is not a substitute for professional medical care and is not intended for use in the diagnosis or treatment of individual conditions. Guests on this podcast express their own opinions, experience, and conclusions. Guest statements on the podcast do not express the opinions of ASCO. The mention of any product, service, organization, activity, or therapy should not be construed as an ASCO endorsement.